I'm Dr. Joshua Straub, and I'm delighted to teach you today on the introduction to community counseling. And community counseling covers a variety of different services within the community itself as you, as a counselor, engage your clients to help them with the best level of care possible. I'm going to start out by giving you a few brief examples of the breadth as well as the depth of community counseling, because it is both deep and wide. Community counseling, really what we're going to cover a lot of today and throughout this particular course, is the breadth of it, the width of it, and how wide the services are for making sure that you are the best community counselor possible, that you're the best counselor that you can be to provide the right services to help the clients that come into your office. So that you know, as you hear the phrase, it takes a village. And it really does take a village to help people and to care for individuals. And so as a counselor, you want to be able to bring together a variety of services within the community to be able to help those that you serve. So as we get started, what I want to do is I want to talk to you specifically about a couple case examples. The first one is Juan. Juan comes into your office, Spanish speaking, has a heroin problem, heroin addiction. He comes into your office and you decide that through his addiction, the best way to help him would be getting him into a methadone program that you know of locally in your community. The problem with that program is that they require United States citizenship, and your client is very concerned because he was born in Mexico. What do you as a counselor do? Another great example would be someone that I call Jane, who is served in the military, but was under a lot of pressure in the military. And what she experienced there was what is known as military sexual trauma. She was harassed quite a bit in the military. She didn't have the money to go to college, and so that's why she entered into the military to begin with. And now you're seeing her sitting across from you as a client, and you have to help her get over this sexual trauma. But she's got anxiety over entering into college and into a career, knowing that she's fighting this battle of previous sexual trauma and the fear of it happening again. How you approach that particular case can really have an impact for this particular woman as she tries to enter into having a very successful career in the future. Another one would be John and Jill. John and Jill, who lost their home in a hurricane. Okay, and let's just say they experienced the hurricane, and they don't lose their home. Let's just say, for instance, let's change this illustration, and let's say that John and Jill, in the hurricane, their home goes relatively undamaged. But it's not that their home is undamaged, it's that the garage that John worked at was damaged, and there's no way that they can rebuild it. So he's out of a job. And his wife Jill doesn't have the income to be able to support the family. And so even though their house is still intact, they don't have a way to raise their 3 children, and they may have to uproot them and move them to where relatives are to help them get through this difficult time. And it's putting a lot of extra added pressure and guilt on them. These are some of the cases that you could be experiencing, and how do you engage the community? How do you engage the community wide at being able to help these particular individuals with these circumstances? 2 other quick ones would be Jake. Jake is and this is very common these days, a teenager, an adolescent who's being bullied at school because he's come out that he's homosexual or that he struggles with homosexual feelings and thoughts. And now you have this individual, this teenager sitting in your office, and you're trying to help him from being bullied, but navigate this struggling sexual attraction that he has. Then you might have Janet, who's depressed because she was a very engaged, career-working woman. And her husband has went up the ladder, but his going up the ladder has required him to move, and where he has to work different hours, where she has to stay at home now with the kids. And let's say they're African American, and he is afforded an opportunity that most African Americans have never been able to. He has broken a barrier, say like Jackie Robinson did. And now he's required to do this, but it's going to require his wife to stay at home, and she's battling depression because she doesn't want to give up her career to stay home and take care of the kids. How do you engage these particular situations? They're diverse. You are dealing with a lot of diversity. You're dealing with different cultures. You're dealing with different races. You're dealing with gender issues, as in the case of Jane. You're also dealing with sexual orientation issues in the case of the adolescent who's come and who's struggling. You also deal with geography and people moving or jobs. You're also dealing with family dynamics. All of these environmental contexts from which people live are a part of who they are. And so there's been a dramatic shift away from person-centered and focused, individualized therapy, if you will, to looking at an individual in their entire environmental context, and how can we as a village come together to help the people that we work with and that we serve, to advocate for them and to counsel them, to help them be successful in what they do in overcoming the presenting problems that they have that they're bringing into your office. All of these groups have commonalities. And what we want to talk about briefly here as we get started in looking at what is community counseling is we want to look at the various services that are provided in community counseling. So for instance, you could have inpatient, and community counseling covers everything pretty much except the inpatient services. So we're not going to talk a lot in this course about what it means for clients to be inpatient. We'll talk about what it means to involuntarily put them in treatment, but and the ramifications and the value struggles that we have in doing that. But we're not going to get into what it means to be inpatient. Instead, what the various levels of community counseling cover are your local counseling center, your day treatment programs for overcoming addiction, or also coming out of jails, and the different probation services that might be available, and the counseling services rendered as a result to help those who were formerly incarcerated to enter back into society and reintegrate into society. You also have VA services to help military veterans who are coming back from battle to re-enter and to reintegrate into their families and as well as into their societies and communities. You also have drug rehabilitation programs. You also have self-help groups and various church-based programs and psychoeducation programs and self-help groups that you also have as a part of this whole genre, if you will, of community counseling and the services that are available. And so one of the important factors to consider is that when you look at all these groups, when you look at gender and you look at race and you look at sexual orientation, you look at family dynamics, you look at geography, you look at all of these factors, there's a lot of commonalities with each of these folks. And those commonalities right here, the most important parts of them are their strengths and their resources, not just their problems. And I think that is something we as counselors need to understand as we look into helping our clients, is that they have strengths and resources that are a part of who each of them are. They don't just have problems. And so we're moving away from a microscopic kind of look into their problems and their issues, and we're looking at a greater whole of their strengths and their resources available to them, and we want to be advocates for that for them. The number two commonality is the desire for positive change. It's present in everybody. Anybody who steps into your office has some level of a desire for positive change, and they're looking to you to help them to get there. And so that's an important commonality. The third one is that many of the barriers that disrupt their development come from their environments, not just their behaviors or characteristics. And so we're looking at this from a holistic perspective. This isn't just about who they are and their behaviors and the way they think and feel and relate and believe. It has to do also because their environments impact all of those things. Whether you live in an abusive environment, whether you live in a neglectful environment, however that looks like, or whether you live in an environment that's healthy. Or whether you, similar to me, grew up in an area where I was predominantly Anglo-Saxon, knowing pretty much I can probably count on one hand the number of minority groups, if you will, that I knew as friends growing up, because I grew up in a very white culture. And so when I went for my master's degree to New York City, I completely had to look into my own attitudes and biases and what I believed about other cultures and how it impacted the way that I related to them. So we're going to talk about these things as you as a counselor to get intrinsically, and we'll get into that in the next one, is how do you believe, or what do you believe about these various groups and the biases that we might hold, the attitudes that we hold, and how it impacts the way that we work with those that we counsel. And so it's important to see that these environments are also impact the way that they believe and the way that they function. And so we'll talk about techniques here and there, but overall what we find is that it's not necessarily the technique that's important. It is really being able to look at the individual holistically, what their environmental background is and where they come from, and how can we render all the services together to really advocate for and counsel our clients in a very effective manner that brings about positive change. With that said, there are a number of different underlying assumptions, I think, as we move into looking at community counseling as a whole and the changes that have taken place through the years in community counseling. There are a number of different assumptions that we want to talk about as we look at this perspective change. And I've already alluded to it, but I want to just talk briefly about it. And that is this perspective change of looking at just the person's problems, looking at just them individually with their behaviors, with their actions, with their belief systems, and the way that they communicate with other people, or they don't communicate with other people, that their dysfunction, if you will, rather than just looking at that individually, we're looking at a whole group. Community counseling has shifted a little bit more away from looking at that and the environment to see how the environment is impacting their behaviors and their belief systems and how they interact. And so looking at that, it's very important, and I love using this line. It goes back to Stephen Covey. Also, we use it in cognitive interpersonal therapy. The whole idea is, in order to understand where other people are coming from and in order to understand who they are, it's important that we first understand them. It's understanding to be understood. If you want them to understand you, you must first understand them and where they came from. And I think as we look at these underlying assumptions, I want us to understand where other people are coming from, but that we also understand where we're coming from so that we can understand them. Because if we have our biases and our attitudes and we're looking at them as specifically the problem, what ends up happening is we create a barrier between us and the client, and we don't allow change to truly happen because we ourselves don't look at the strengths and resources available to them. And so some of the underlying assumptions we look at: number one, human development and behavior is in an environmental context. So there are risk and protective factors. So for instance, if you're looking at a teenager and you look at their home life and you hear maybe he's being bullied, maybe he is very frustrated and wants a way out of his home, threatening to run away, and you look at what's going on in the context of the home and the context of the school, it may be that he's living with an abusive mother. It could very well also be that his mother is perfectly secure and safe, and he has a very loving family, but he himself has a substance abuse problem that he hasn't clearly been honest about, and he's the problem. Usually it's a little bit of both. Usually there's some truth in the middle, but until you really look at the environment, you're not understanding why he might be being bullied, why he's bullying others, or why he's feeling the way that he is living in the context of his home. And so we have to understand the risk and protective factors that are available to the clients that we have. Important protective factors include the support system that they have around them, marriage, healthy marriage, having parents who love them, having friends and family and coworkers and a healthy environment. The healthier a social support system is, research shows that to be a very important factor in being able to help clients overcome their presenting problems. There's also risk factors, and those would include things I mentioned, abuse and neglect. You might also have that they're in a very poor school system. If you're talking about a teenager, they could be in a poor school system where they don't have great teachers, they don't have great discipline strategies, grades are poor, and they have a very hard time and getting out of the environment that they're in. So we're going to talk about specific programs that are being created to help students overcome risk factors that may even be outside of their own control. So number one is that human development and behavior is in the context of a whole environment, if you will. The second one is that even in devastating stress, people treated with respect have strengths to overcome and access to resources. We have to understand that even in devastating stress, we can't be pessimistic as counselors. We've got to see their strengths, and we've got to see and have a black book of community resources available that we can say, hey, look, you can go to this particular place and they will be able to help you. So these are huge factors as a counselor to be able to advocate, as an advocate for your clients. The third one is attention must be paid to the multicultural nature of human development. And I want to just briefly talk about this. No matter if you are living in an area that, like I grew up, where it's one complete culture and pretty much one ethnic group or one race, you may not have to deal with any of the multicultural things that we talk about. But what's very important to understand is that we are living in the most diverse generation in the history of America. And so by 2050, research shows that whites will be a minority group, will be the minority over and above all the other groups. And so we are living more and more in an assimilated culture where we're coming together with other races and other ethnic groups and other cultures. And it's important that we, no matter whether we're African American, Asian American, Caribbean American, whether we're white Anglo-Saxon, whether we're Hispanic, whatever we are looking as counselors, as Christian counselors, our unique biases, our unique attitudes, the things that we take into the counseling office in our ability to help those that we serve, that we are being Christ-centered, that we're being Christocentric in the way that we interact with our clients and the community to bring about the best care possible. Because as Christian counselors, we represent Jesus Christ. And we want to make sure that our own stuff isn't getting in the way. So we want to see their strengths and the resources that are available to them to help them, our clients, succeed. And the last one is that individual and community development are inseparable and inextricably linked. They are linked together. When I see clients, I automatically, in my brain, start thinking from the first day of assessment, I start thinking about who in the community, what programs in the community can I also bring around this individual to help him or her succeed, to help this family be the best family that they can be, to relate with one another the way that they want to relate in a very healthy way. Who is the village that I can bring around them? Who can I refer them to? Is there churches available? Are there other programs, psychoeducation programs? Are there self-help groups? Are there parenting classes? Are there marriage intensives? What else can I bring into the fold to help the clients that I serve, the people that God brings into my life, into my counseling office? Am I doing everything that I can to not just help them individually, but to bring around the community of believers? And this goes back to Deuteronomy. When Moses was giving his very last, it was one of his last speeches before he turns it over to Joshua, his ministry over to Joshua, and the continued exodus from Egypt. Moses stands up and everybody's waiting to hear him. Everybody is just on the edge of their seat waiting to hear what Moses is going to say. And he starts by addressing, "Hear, O Israel. Hear, O Israel. Remember God's commandments. Remember what He has brought you out of. Write them on your doorposts. Bind them around your neck. Make sure that you remember God's commands and that you pass them on to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. Hear, O Israel. That phrase, hear, O Israel, isn't just about moms and dads and individual families. That is addressing, Moses back in that time addressed the entire community of believers. How can we as an entire community of believers come together to love and pass on a generation of believers, a generation, a legacy from generation to generation? How can we come together and do that? And as Christian counselors, that is honestly the call that we have. That we are doing the best job that we can do to bring the community together to impact the clients that come into our lives and those that we serve. Are you doing that? Because you, maybe even more than anybody else, may be the only Jesus they ever see, but you also may be the only person who comes into their life who can actually speak truth into the generational sins, the generational curses, the things that are impacting that family from generation to generation. Not just that family, but let me say the community, the generation of community turmoil, the generational poverty, if you will. In that community, you could be the advocate, the one person who could step in to change that generation and leave a legacy in your community or in that particular family. That's the call of God on us as community counselors. That's what it means to come around and be a community. Hear, O Israel. We are broken in relationships, but we're also healed in relationships. And in Genesis chapter 2, it says, "It is not good that man be alone." Even before the fall of mankind, before sin had even entered the world, God said there was one thing that wasn't good, and that was that man was alone.